Great. So I guess we could begin. Thank you all for showing up on this late Friday afternoon. Weeks pass by really quickly. But yeah, I guess as part of the series of this workshop, what we're trying to do as well is to connect you all with various scholars who are doing innovative work in the field of computational social science. And I guess this is a first of a lot of different, this is like probably the only one for during the semester, because I think we're focusing on web scraping series, developing a web scraping skill set during the semester. But I think that I think we'll have more of these research talks, which I honestly think of more as research discussions in a way. It's not necessarily like a formal presentation that we would see in other workshops or like colloquium. But I kind of want this to be more of like, here's a cool method of a research idea that I'm developing along the way, or I've already developed a lot. What do you all think? What questions you all have, to kind of open up the space a little bit more to folks of all different skill levels. And like next semester, we're working, I guess Will, Scott, and I are working on sort of lists of speakers planned, because that's what a lot of y'all wanted in terms of a feedback. And if any of you have your own type of research that dabbles in computational social science that you're interested in sharing, you're kind of, even if it's like in its formative stages, I think it'd be cool to share what our research project that we're all working on different levels. So, and to like keep speakers in mind that you would want to see out of this group and you would want to meet. So I think I'll send a more formal email later on during the semester in order to like let you all know more firmly what that process would be. But I guess for now, like I think y'all met Scott a couple weeks ago, but for those who don't know, he's a recent assistant professor in sociology who's hired here for this semester, and his own research are in like social networks. He does cool stuff on studying crime and deviance, and basically applying a lot of computational methods to a lot of different interesting sub-areas in sociology. So I will let you introduce your own topic for now, Scott, and you have the mantle. And I will give you the host powers.
Yes, that would be great. Thanks. So I did prepare a little more of a formal presentation today. That's part of, just by design, this project is pretty far along the way. But one of the things y'all talked about a lot when we did the earlier poll was getting more insight to networks and using digital trace data. So I thought this project would be kind of a good one to show you, as many of you have to kind of pivot your dissertation projects or side projects or whatever to adapt to the fact that there's much less access to face-to-face data given the pandemic. So I think in that way it provides a good oversight. Before I jump into it, I also just wanted to follow up on what Todd was saying about outside speakers. I did manage to book David Malamed. He was one of my co-advisors at Ohio State, and he's currently co-editor of Sociological Methodology, which is the ASA Top Methods Journal. And he's going to be presenting in the spring on some work he's published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences on network effects and small group settings. So I think we should be able to look forward to that. I think Dave's a very smart guy, so I'm sure it'll be a great talk. So let me figure out the Zoom stuff here. Cool. So the project I'm talking about today is on illegal market dynamics, and particularly darknet drug trafficking. This is a project I actually started during my very first year of graduate school and have been involved in. I've helped write and get 2 NSF grants to pursue data collection on this. And it kind of, again, I think it provides a nice like oversight of different ways of thinking through how to use digital trace data, how to think about network effects, and to apply them to topics that we might be interested in, but have difficulty getting data either because of the ongoing pandemic or for some other reason. So to start out, the focus of this project is really to think through how illegal markets operate. So illegal markets are really, really big, illegal drug markets especially. Since the year 2000, the drug overdose rate or mortality rate from drug overdose in the United States has quadrupled. And it's not actually just isolated to the United States. It's a global drug pandemic. Since 2010, the rate of drug mortality has increased by about 30%. And in 2017, about 500,000 people died from drug overdose. So it's had this huge public health implications, but it also demands a huge amount of money to regulate. The United States spends about 1% of its GDP on either drug use or combating drug use in some way. So it amounts to, in 2010, about $108 billion spent on legal drugs alone. So it's a huge amount of kind of distribution and consumption going on. And we know from the sociology of markets to actually fill these consumption needs at that scale, what you really need is for a market to reach stability. It's what Neil Fligstein calls a stable world. The idea is if a market is volatile, it's really hard to actually produce at a massive scale. So this brings us to the question, how do illegal markets grow and how do they develop? How do they become a stable world to meet these distribution needs? So this is a question that isn't really new. Like tons of people are interested in illegal markets, from public policy to economics to sociology and criminology. But we actually don't have a great understanding of how they work. And a big reason is it's just so hard to get the data. So getting transaction records or trade records on normal organizations is typically hard. But with illegal markets, it's really, really hard. And the reason is people just don't keep transaction records at the same scale for illegal drug trade. Some banks do, but for the most part, it's not as rigorous. And if you do have those records, you're probably not going to be sharing it with researchers because they don't help you in any way, and they can have really bad consequences. And so most research on illegal markets has actually been primarily qualitative, descriptive, or completely theoretical. So economists love to write models about kind of elasticity and risk and resilience in illegal markets without a strong empirical component. So what we're trying to do is bring in darknet drug trafficking to think through illegal markets, think through how they grow, think through how they develop. So darknet drug markets are relatively new on the scene. The first one developed in 2011. It was run by Ross Ulbricht, and it was called the Silk Road. And the market was kind of just realizing this like libertarian dream of Ross Ulbricht, who thought, you know, free market, fair competition, just let people sell whatever and let the market regulate itself. And it was shut down in 2013. And by the standards of darknet drug markets, it really wasn't that successful. It only generated about $200,000 in revenue per year. But what it did was it showed exactly how these markets could operate and how they could be more successful. And so only 5 years later, or 4 years later, in 2015, there was about 20 or 30 markets that were bigger than the original Silk Road. And the largest 5 were generating almost $200 million in revenue per year. By today, the darknet counts for approximately 1% of all global drug trafficking, and online drug trade more generally accounts for about 10%. So the darknet has really proliferated at this rapid scale. And the nice thing about looking at darknet drug trafficking is we're able to get this really rich digital trace data on the frequency of drug transactions, patterns of drug transactions, and timing of drug transactions, as well as a host of all other characteristics. And we're kind of leveraging these rich data components to make sense of how these markets are developing and how they get out of these early stages where there really is no trust and people don't know each other. So the sociology of markets really points to a problem confronted by illegal markets. Markets to conduct trade typically rely heavily on governmental oversight. You need some kind of state supervision in place in order to enforce contract rights, to kind of lay out the rules of the game, and to honestly sue people if people violate contracts. And so when you get to these forms of unregulated trade, you typically need a different type of assurance structure. In pre-modern trade, for instance, where people would like fare across the ocean and have to engage in high-risk trade, typically what they relied on is social networks. The networks would kind of form and allow people to surveil one another, share reputational information, and otherwise just kind of look out for one another. And this exact same thing actually happens in illegal markets. It tends to come down to network dependency. People rely on people that they know or people who can be vouched for. And so what we see up here in this right-hand corner, the I know a guy who knows a guy, this is a triadic configuration in a network sense. It emerges from a third party. I can't see my pointer there. I can't, anyways, it's a triadic configuration. And it emerged from a third party referral. If you know somebody who knows somebody, you can refer that person to one another and essentially close a triad. And this helps build reputation. And it's really important for actually assuring cooperation in a legal trade, especially in offline settings, because it essentially builds trust where people otherwise would not trust each other. What's interesting is when we look to research on online markets, they've almost universally kind of discredited the explanation that networks matter at all. So the reasoning here is that if you know a guy who knows a guy, you first have to know a guy, right? And in online settings, people don't know each other. Everybody's anonymous. And so the reasoning has been you really can't have network governance emerge in online settings because nobody knows anybody else, and so there are no social bonds to leverage into economic relations. Instead, the argument in both online legal and illegal markets has been that it's all about reputations. So this is a screenshot from a vendor's page on a darknet market. The vendor sells, meth and apparently a lot of weed and benzos. And what we see here is that they rely on this reputation system a lot like eBay. It should look pretty familiar. This plus 4,706 refers to the cumulative sum of all sales ratings that the vendor has gained from past exchanges, and the negative 17 is the negative sales ratings. And what it shows is that this person has a really good reputation. They engage in a lot of really good trade. They have good quality, good speed, good communication. So what's interesting then is that we're seeing contradictory explanations. So on one hand, our classical work on risky trade, social exchange, and conditions of uncertainty both say that people really rely on networks to build trust. And online settings actually increase risk and uncertainty even further because of information asymmetry. People don't know what products they're buying before they get it, and so the risk is increased even further. And when you think about an online illegal setting, the risk is even higher because people inherently distrust one another more. And if a drug is contaminated when you buy it, then it's not just like you got ripped off, it could kill you. If you think you're buying heroin and you get fentanyl, you're probably going to overdose. So the risk is increased even further, and yet the argument has been that networks don't matter. So the last vein of research we're kind of pulling in to make sense of illegal market dynamics is the criminological research on organized offending. And when we look at criminal organizations and the research on there, we actually get this really ambiguous story about how networks should matter. Kind of the rule in criminal organizations is that networks are really, really important for recruiting new members. They kind of assure trust and they help people get into the trade. And we know that when networks are stable and cohesive, they tend to increase the success and the lifespan of criminal organizations. But at the same time, we also know that stable ties are really, really rare. And so even though long-lasting ties and cohesive networks are really important for generating criminal success within organizational settings, they tend not to be stable enough to actually be mobilized into profitable outcomes. And so based on this idea of kind of network dependency in criminal organizations, the conclusion we'd reach is that stable ties are probably too rare to actually generate market success. So our goal here is to kind of take some of these claims to task and really evaluate the role of networks within online illegal markets and question how they might emerge even in settings of anonymity and high risk and uncertainty. So our broad argument is that you actually don't need to know the other people in order to have network mechanisms matter. So in previous research, especially the work of Mark Granovetter and Brian Utsi, the argument has been that if you have a pre-existing social network, it provides a source of social capital and trust that you can mobilize into a trade relationship to conduct further trade. But even though actors are anonymous when they get into a market, it doesn't mean they stay anonymous. When you trade with one another over time, you develop social relationships. You come to become familiar with one another, become familiar with the product, and you actually tend to communicate. It's not like people stay anonymous in the sense that they're only trading. They're also communicating about the nature of trade, about the products that are being delivered, if trade is taking longer than usual. So these all provide social content and they provide social context. And the consequence is that kind of embeddedness in economic networks can actually generate social capital, which then is mobilized into further trade relationships. So our goal here is to think about two network mechanisms. Now, one is actually fairly well studied in experimental research and a little bit of research on markets, and that's repeated trade. And the idea here is that the more you trade with the same person over time, you become more familiar with them, and it helps to reduce uncertainty. So experimental work has actually shown that the more uncertain a trade environment is, the more trust is gained from repeated transactions. And so repeated trade should matter a lot. But one of the reasons it's been dismissed in earlier work on online markets is that when you look at repeated trade in legal online markets, it tends to be really, really uncommon. So about 3 to 5% of transactions on legal markets like eBay tend to be repetitions. The other 97 to 95% are new exchanges. So our thinking here is that because the uncertainty and risk is so much higher in an illegal market, repeated trade should matter more. Our second mechanism is four-cycle closure. So this is a different way of thinking about network effects in online illegal markets. Usually when we think about a network structural effect, we think about those triangles, those third-party network referrals. But in a buyer-vendor market that operates like a bazaar, you really can't have triadic closure. And the reason is these yellow nodes at the bottom are buyer accounts. And in order to be a vendor account, you have to register as a vendor account. And so buyer accounts can't actually trade with one another, and triangles can't actually close. What this creates is what's called in the network literature a bipartite graph, where exchanges are only possible between nodes that occupy distinct roles in the network. So our reasoning here is that this four-cycle mechanism actually acts as an indirect referral. If two buyers have purchased from one another in the past, or if two buyers have purchased from the same vendor in the past, then they're going to take the other's purchasing pattern as kind of an indicator of quality. If I'm looking through the purchasing history of a vendor and I see a buyer I'm familiar with, I'm more likely to see that vendor as selling products that have decent quality, that are recognizable, and kind of take that buyer's purchasing patterns as an indicator of trustworthiness. So to kind of illustrate the face validity of this argument, here's kind of the mechanism we're thinking about. So this is a screenshot of the sales history of the vendor. And we can see that there you can recognize immediately the usernames of other buyers. And so say I'm scrolling through this new vendor's page, I see Sabbath 1120, and I say, oh, I know Sabbath 1120. I've seen him in this other guy I purchased with. This new person is probably decent. And that's kind of what's closing the four-cycle, that name recognition. So this is operating largely the same way as triadic closure, except now instead of a direct referral, I know a guy who knows a guy, it's an indirect referral, interpreting this shared purchasing history as a signal of trustworthiness. So the last thing we're thinking about here in this project is time dependency. So fundamentally, to become a stable world, illegal markets have to get out of these high-risk nascent stages. And so our argument is that networks should actually matter more in early stage markets, but can actually hurt markets when they become overdeveloped. So this is kind of closely informed by Brian Utzi's argument about the paradox of embeddedness. On one hand, networks can ensure trust and build social capital. They can promote trade relationships and in that way help markets grow. But the risk is when networks become overdeveloped, a product of excessive trust is that people don't switch vendors very frequently. They tend to stay with the same vendors and strong coalitions tend to form. The result is that it's actually very, very hard for new vendors to enter into the market, and it reduces incentives for vendors to essentially cut prices or engage in market competition. And the result is that excessive network embeddedness can actually slow the frequency of drug trade by essentially herding out new vendors and discouraging competition. So these are our two main hypotheses, that repeated exchange and four-cycle closure will both contribute to the rate of illegal drug trade, and second, that their effects will be really strong and positive in early stage markets, but really actually negative as the market matures. So to test our hypotheses, we scraped data from Silk Road 3.1. And what makes our data really unique is we managed to get it in the very first stages of market development. So we were able to trace the very first month of drug trade in, I think it was January 2018, and follow it for 14 months of market activity. So our market actually isn't very big by the standards of darknet drug markets, but what makes this data novel is that we get it at this very early stage. So we have data on 7,047 buyer accounts, 169 vendor accounts, and approximately 17,000 drug exchanges that happened over the period. To construct the networks, what we did was we connected the vendor accounts to these sales reviews. So an interesting thing about darknet markets is they actually require mandatory sales reviews. So in order to finalize a sale, you have to make a preliminary review. And then once you get the drugs, you can go back and change it. And what this means is that you can actually get the complete population of public drug exchanges from a darknet drug market and really fine-grained data on timing. So as you see from the comments here, it has data on the type of drug being sold, how much people paid in US dollars, and the timing of the drug delivery, as well as kind of textual information about how people felt about the drug exchange. So we use these data to reconstruct the time-varying network of illicit drug exchange on Silk Road 3.1. So when you have this really fine-grained timing data, you have to do a bit different strategies for analyzing the network model. The traditional strategy for longitudinal network analysis follows from kind of network panel data collection. The idea that you measure somebody at 1 year and then maybe 3 years later, you can get another measurement of the network. And this treats the timing as kind of coarse chunks, and you're just kind of imputing changes or modeling the discrete changes between network states. When you have fine-grained timing information, you don't want to have to aggregate up to these levels, because then you're losing a lot of information about how the structural and temporal aspects of network growth interact. And so we're using relational event models. These are relatively new models and relatively underused in sociology, but really what they are hazard models for network data. So this is a REM, and if you're familiar with hazard analysis, this might look familiar, because really the model reduces to a Cox model or discrete time event history, depending on how you want to estimate it, after you compute endogenous statistics on the network. So what we have here is the probability of realizing a number of ties or drug exchanges between an IJ dyad at the time period t. So we're assuming a non-homogeneous local Poisson process, and that means that the rate, or you can get essentially a number of transactions at a given time period and not have to parse out independent time periods for every transaction. Lambda is the hazard rate, and that is what we're modeling as a function of covariates. So the hazard rate takes a more familiar form. It's a multiplicative function of your input data and whatever regression coefficients you want. So X is the k-dimensional data matrix, k being the number of variables in your model. And X contains both your network statistics that are computed on the event history, as well as exogenous covariates that you bring in from other data, such as vendor characteristics or buyer characteristics or time characteristics. So the endogenous network effects we're looking at are all defined here. The two key variables are sales inertia and four-cycle closure. Sales inertia is just referring to the number of repeated exchanges. So since relational events reset at every time period, inertia refers to the prevalence of repeated events, or how much these events persist across time. So it's a weighted function of how many drug exchanges have occurred between a buyer and a vendor in the past. Four-cycle closure also essentially is a weighted count of the number of four cycles closed by a potential drug transaction, and it increases in value as more four cycles are closed by each transaction. The vendor market activity and buyer market activity are both degree centrality measures. They measure the number of drug exchanges that a vendor or buyer has participated in over the entire course of the market's activity. So this accounts for the fact that some vendors or buyers might just purchase at greater or lesser rates. And then finally, the last thing is a recency weight. This is merely a weighting function that assigns higher priority to more recent events. And so not all repeated exchanges are treated equally. If we exchanged once a year and a half ago, it's going to be treated as less influential to my current trading patterns than if we exchanged once 3 months ago. And that's what that weight function is doing. For our exogenous covariate effects, we measure the cumulative reputations, which are monotonic, so they're constantly trending in one direction as people sum over their sales ratings. We're also measuring the negative reputations. So this is the sum of all negative sales evaluations that a vendor has received in a given month. So it resets it every month, and the idea here is that if people get a really large string of bad sales evaluations, it's going to provide an exogenous shock to their drug trade activity. We also control for vendor location, measured at the national level. We control for the type of drug being sold, and we control for the number of drugs a vendor sells. So if they sell 9 different types of drugs, they're more likely to span across consumer bases, and that can affect their purchasing patterns or their distribution patterns. We also control for international shipping and the time at risk using linear, quadratic, and polynomial specifications, or cubic specifications, sorry, for the time period. And then finally, to get rid of heterogeneity and the buyer purchasing rates, we cluster our standard errors on buyers. Results are the same when you use a frailty model instead, but it's just more computationally difficult because the risk set for these data is pretty large. Okay, so to start out, I'm going to describe the data a bit. This is the bipartite exchange network observed in kind of 3 chunks of about 4 months. What we can see is about exponential growth, which is exactly consistent with what we'd expect. In the early stage markets, it's higher risk, so people are buying less. So here between January and April, there's about 1,000 drug exchanges. Between May and September, there's about, I think it was 3,000. And then the remaining 12 to 13,000 or whatever it is occurred between October and February. So exponential growth patterns. We can also see a few handful of vendors becoming highly embedded, which is exactly consistent with our expectations, and kind of crowding out the other vendors as they increasingly dominate transactions. Now, descriptively, we also see kind of support for our expectations as well. Recall that in the online context of legal markets, repeated exchange tends to be pretty rare. But here we actually see that repeat exchange accounts for about 1/3 of all transactions. And so in the context of a legal drug trade, the repeated exchange is about 5 times as common as the context of eBay. So this again provides support to our expectation that repeated exchange is probably pretty fairly common here. Next thing we did was look at the clustering coefficient. So you can get a bipartite clustering coefficient, which essentially measures the ratio of open 4 cycles to closed 4 cycles. So coefficient of 0.05 means that for every 20 open 4 cycles, we get 1 closed 4 cycle. Now, that's a little hard to interpret because as networks scale in size, structural measures are always going to scale as well. So it's not immediately clear whether we should interpret this as large or small. So the way the steps we took to interpret this was I simulated about 100 networks of the same size and density as the observed network and calculated the clustering coefficient on every single one. And what we found was that the average clustering coefficient for the random networks was about 0.01, and the Monte Carlo p-value was 0. And so what this means is that we have a significant difference in the clustering coefficient where, on average, the clustering coefficient is about 5 times as large as we would see in a random network of the same size with the same amount of drug exchanges or ties within. So this is again consistent with our expectation where clustering plays an important role in generating market growth. So the descriptive results are broadly consistent with what we've been expecting and arguing, and now we're going to turn to REM to really parse out the market behavior. So in the first model, we have all control variables, and then we include inertia and 4 cycles. And we see positive significant effects for both sales inertia and 4 cycle closure. If you exponentiate, you get an odds ratio for inertia of about 1.3, which tells you that a 1 unit increase in the sales inertia measure correlates with about a 30% increase in the odds of a drug exchange occurring at a given time period. The 4 cycle closure measure is telling you something similar. If you exponentiate that, you get the odds ratio between 1.1 and 1.2, which is again telling you that the hazard rate increases by about 20 to 30% for a 1 unit increase in 4 cycle closure. So I'll dedicate a little more time to interpreting effect size shortly, but before we jump into that, the next step is really to account for possible confounding. So we have all these control variables, but one of the weaknesses of digital trace data is you are limited in the extent to variables you can collect, simply because the architecture of the network or architecture of the website constrains you. And so what I'm going to do now is take through a series of models that eliminate several sources of unobserved heterogeneity. So the first possibility is that vendors really have these spillover reputations. There's other markets they operated in within before, people knew them from there, and when they go to a new market, they bring that reputation with them. So one way to control for that is to include vendor fixed effects. What this does is it holds any time invariant differences between vendors constant, and so if they're simply importing reputations from earlier markets, we control for that in this model. And we see that the results are robust. There's some attenuation in the coefficients, but because this is a nonlinear probability model, you can't really interpret the change in coefficients itself anyways. So the significance and the direction, though, is consistent. The second thing is that there could be some unmeasurable vendor characteristic that changes over the course of the market. It could be that vendors are very active on forums and develop these informal reputations that we're not catching. So the way we can control for that is by constructing vendor time period interactions. And what we're doing in this model is we're actually eliminating all vendor level variation. It's impossible to have anything happening at the vendor level that will confound our results in this next model because it's all held constant. And again, the results are robust. So this is again telling us that there's nothing unmeasured, either time invariant or time varying at the vendor level that's confounding our results. The final possibility is that it's something about the dyad. So again, from these earlier market researchers, the argument has been that dyads import pre-existing social capital into a new relationship. And so it's possible that the vendor and the buyer know each other from a different market or from communicating on Reddit or something like that. And the way we can control for that is by now including dyad fixed effects. And this holds constant all-time invariant variation for all buyer-vendor pairs. And again, our results are consistent. And so this is showing us that no matter where we kind of account for various sources of confounding, we get the same substantive picture about strong positive network effects emerging. So the next step is to really tease into effect size, because again, odds ratios aren't remarkably intuitive, and they're not actually informative interpretations on their own in nonlinear probability models for various technical reasons. So here what we did was we calculated the change in predicted probability per standard deviation change for each measure. And our comparison effect is the cumulative reputation score. And the reason again is so much prior research has emphasized the importance of reputations that this kind of contextualized the relevance of network effects. And what we see is regardless of measure, moving one standard deviation above or below the mean tends to increase the predicted probability by about the same amount, whether it's cumulative reputations, forward cycles, or sales inertia. In particular, the change in probability is about the same at about 0.02. So, but what's really interesting about this result is that it's not all changes in standard deviation are equal. If you plug these measures back into the statistics we calculated earlier, it only takes one prior transaction in the previous month to increase the sales inertia measured by one standard deviation. So if I'm buying drugs in February and I'm thinking about a new vendor, all I would have to do is trade with a vendor in January in order to get this change in standard deviation. Same thing with 4 cycles. To increase the 4 cycles measured by one standard deviation, you just need to close 3 4 cycles that emerged in the prior month. So it's not a huge amount of change in the network structure, it just requires well-poised economic ties. Now, to increase the cumulative reputation score by one standard deviation, it takes about an increase of a little over 1,000 reputation points. And when you average that out based on the mean for the cumulative reputation, that means that you need to finalize 366 sales and get 5-star ratings on every single one to increase cumulative reputations by one standard deviation. And so what this is telling us is that even though the network effects are comparable per standard deviation change across measures, it actually requires fewer successful drug transactions, as long as they're well positioned to yield a comparable change in the probability of drug exchange as we would get from cumulative reputation score. So our final goal, again, is to interpret the early stage effects of network dynamics on a legal drug trade. And so in Model 5, we include interactions between time and each network measure. And we're seeing coefficients consistent with primary results. The main effects are positive, the interactions are negative, and that means declining effects as time passes. So again, interaction coefficients aren't really interpretable in nonlinear probability models. So these are non-parametric mappings of the time interactions here. And we can see pretty consistent results, especially for 4-cycle closure. Here at the late stage, 14th time period, the hazard rate is highest when a drug exchange doesn't include any 4 cycles. Similarly, looking across time, at the early stage of the market where 4 cycles are high, this yields the greatest effect of 4-cycle closure, but that effect declines as time passes. So this is again consistent with expectations. The sales inertia coefficient is more difficult to interpret, and this has just something to do with the way hazard rates behave, which I'm happy to talk about later. But we generally see a consistent story here, where as time passes, there appears to be at least a slight and gradual decline in the hazard of drug exchange. So we can actually take a parametric approach to make this a little more interpretable. And so the final thing that I did was conduct a mediated moderation analysis. So in Model 6, what we do is we include the interactions without reputation controls and calculate the average marginal effect for each time period. So the average marginal effect is just the increase in the probability of realizing a drug exchange per unit increase independent variable per time period. And we map it for every time period. And then in Model 7, we re-include the reputations and interactions between reputations and time. And we calculate the change in average marginal effect. And that change in average marginal effect gives us essentially a mediation statistic for each time period. And so what we're showing, exactly consistent with expectations, is that the increases in average marginal effect, or the positive effect of network structure, is greatest in the early stage markets and then declines by late stage markets. What we're also showing is that part of the reason networks are so important in early stage markets is that they help people build reputations. So they're really facilitating trust and establishing the trustworthiness of other vendors. But once the market becomes well embedded, excessive reliance on network dependence stops actually helping market actors build reputations and can actually hurt the prevalence of trade by essentially crowding out new vendors. Okay, so to summarize results, we found consistent results with both hypotheses. Repeated exchange and forced cycle closure, on average, increase the frequency of illegal drug trade, and they really have the strongest effects in emerging markets, but kind of negative effects once markets become overdeveloped and network structure can be redundant or even harmful. And so the punchline here is that we really have support for this idea that the economic networks help to build trust in emerging markets, but can be damaging once these illegal online markets become over-embedded. So this provides us with a few theoretical implications. First, we're showing that it's not actually necessary for people to know each other for networks to matter. You can have these economic exchange relations build social capital, even in anonymous exchange settings, strictly by the endogenous trade structure. It's the structure of economic ties that's building social relationships and building trust. We're also showing that these emergence of these trade structures provide a really powerful force to facilitate trade in early stage markets and are kind of essential to getting these early stage markets off the ground where reputational information isn't well established and people don't have reputation scores to rely on. I think I went over all these points. But the kind of punchline here again is that economic trade structure really provides a powerful assurance in high-risk illegal trade. So back to this kind of paradox that we talked about in the beginning about how actors engage in trade in unregulated, unsupervised, risky, and anonymous exchange settings. And our answer to this question really has to do with the configurations of the exchange relationships. And so if people are able to even start kind of with a very small amount of exchanges and form strong network structures, the market can then develop. As far as implications, some of my earlier work has argued that one of the more effective strategies for disrupting illegal online markets is network interventions that use network structures to target policing. And what this result, that network structure is most impactful in the early stage of markets, means is that any network interventions designed at disrupting online illegal markets should really be tailored to the early stage markets rather than the later stage markets where the network structure is more robust. Another implication is that these endogenous trade structures are likely to influence other coordination problems. So markets are faced with coordination problems in the form of ensuring cooperation, which is what we focused on primarily. But the other coordination problems faced by markets include competition. How do actors kind of ensure fair competition and kind of meet each other's standards to try to get customers? And also valuation. How do people assign value to goods and what makes it effective? And our reasoning here is that endogenous trade structures probably play out in these settings as well, especially by herding out competitors in terms of competition and assigning value to goods by establishing trust in a risky environment. Okay, so I think, yep, that's all I got. So I'm gonna stop share right now, and I think I made good time, so I can open it up for questions. Elena, yeah.
Thank you. Very cool presentation. I'm not really familiar with the network analysis and with the networks that you discussed, but I had an impression that you said that the network that you studied was very visible. I mean, it was a mandatory interaction between the sender and the buyer. and we observe the social capital links and all this stuff. But do you think that your assumption might travel to the networks which are less observable for participants when we don't really see all the links, all the communication, cooperation, and whatever? Do you think that the direction of how social trust, not social trust, social capital will be developing there will be the same? And how observability here influences the direction of in which the network is going and cooperation of members is going?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So usually when we think about networks and online settings, we do have a highly visible structure in a lot of ways. For that four-cycle closure mechanism to work, you really have to be able to observe it. But usually in real-world offline settings where the network isn't as visible, people kind of have an awareness of network structure through less visible cues, but more interpersonal cues. And so, for instance, if you think about, even friendship networks in school, people don't really see the network. They don't see the structure, but they see each other and they communicate and they get a sense of network structure based on that. So the expectation, and some of what's been shown in prior research, is if you have a condition of high uncertainty and people don't know a lot about who else is working on the market and what kind of the risk set is, then they tend to stick with what they know. And so the network effects actually tend to get even more powerful the fewer options people have, because they get trapped within the local network clusters that they know and are familiar with. Other questions?
Yeah, I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I was thinking about was the reputation itself,
Mm-hmm.
and other ways of managing reputation among these sellers or these communities, and other ways that they could communicate this, like forums of some kind. Did Silk Road have big forums where people talk about this? And were there a lot of discussions of reputations of the good sellers, the bad sellers, the good buyers, bad buyers, who's a Fed, who's not, that sort of thing?
Yeah, a ton of it.
And if you sort of looked at that, do you think it would be much different based on the sort of way that reputation was expressed, like the forum model versus the sort of rating model?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it is. I think it's a big deal, and it's so our second Darknet grant actually is collecting that exact data. So we're collecting data from forums, and we're using natural language processing to measure different types of trust signaling strategies and to kind of get a sense of what's happening on the forums and how it affects market operations quantitatively. So if you're wondering, for the current models, the exact reason I included the vendor time interactions was specifically because of that exact concern. There could be things happening outside of the market. Vendors often go to the forums to give out free samples and provide advice, and we know that helps them build informal reputation. So those vendor time interaction models were very important for exactly taking care of that concern. But in terms of substantive interest, there is a lot going on in those forums in terms of how vendors signal and the networks that emerge within the forums themselves. And so the goal of our current grant is to take that information and then merge it with what's happening on the markets and try to get a sense of what exactly is happening discursively that affects market operations.
I had Alexis, you unmuted yourself, so I'll let you go.
Oh, sorry. That was really interesting, Scott. I was wondering if any in this as an extension or any future work, you were gonna look at if there are like what the profiles are of the people who take the first risk and or like take on that initial or larger risk in buying from really new sellers. Because it's like somebody has to do that, right? But like, I don't know, I'm just curious about like who those people are and how that happens when the seller doesn't have a reputation at all to begin with.
Yeah, right. And that's kind of, it's kind of a funny thing, because like one of our critiques of the reputation argument is that it can't really explain what's happening in an emerging market. And we're finding that networks can, but we're also kind of like shrinking the time window, because you can't have a trade network until trade happens. So we're kind of like saying we're providing a better answer, but we're not really answering the question either.
Yeah.
we're just pushing the burden back a lot. So, our reasoning is some of these markets are really unsuccessful, actually. A lot of them try to get off the ground and then fail. And right now, the claim we're making, and we're trying to posture to get better traction on, is that one of the determining factors may be whether or not networks emerge from the early traders. Now, back to your question about the early risk takers among buyers. It's pretty interesting because if you look at these markets, there's actually not a ton of variation among the buyers and the buyer profiles. There's a little, but it's really not the amount of variation that you would expect. It's pretty homogenous, which is kind of surprising. My expectation, and what has been kind of reinforced by qualitative work, is that a lot of the early stage risk taking is supported by kind of vendor entrepreneurialism. So they'll go on forums. One of the biggest forums for recruiting people in darknet markets is Reddit. There's a subreddit called Crypto Markets, and it's filled with memes and things like that and guides on how to attract new customers. And so people will often go on there and kind of advertise themselves. If they're vendors who have an established presence on other markets, they're often able to import those reputations as well. And that kind of helps them attract new buyers and alleviate some of the risk. And so some of it is merely the migratory patterns and kind of importing reputations from earlier versions of the markets in order to kind of attract those initial customers.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question if someone else wasn't going to go. Yeah, this is a really interesting paper. So could you remind me, in your model, you controlled for the type of drug, but did you also controlled for whether or not the product was a drug, or were you only looking at drug sales?
We only looked at drugs. So there are other products for sale on Silk Road 3.1, but they are a very small majority, or very small minority in comparison. And what's interesting is very few drug vendors also sell kind of anything else. So the other stuff on there is like contraband, like stolen Netflix accounts and stolen porn accounts and things like that. And very few people sell contraband and drugs, and very few buyers buy contraband and drugs. So it's a small minority, and it actually operates mostly independently of the drug market.
Okay, because one thing I was wondering is like how much the network behavior has to do with like the fact that the thing that's being purchased is a drug, in terms of like the repetitiveness of purchases from particular buyers. And would be curious if you would expect the same behavior to transfer across products, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto a good point, which is there is the kind of illegality component, and then there's the addictiveness. And one of the things that we actually see on the market is that the preference for repeated exchange actually holds for non-addictive substances as well. So people tend to go back to the same buyers for psychedelics, and they tend to go back to the same buyers for ecstasy, and they tend to go back to the same buyers for weed, and then they also tend to go back to the same buyers for heroin. So there is a kind of still a preference for repeated exchange. But one of the interesting things is that the rate of repeated exchange doesn't actually increase much for addictive drugs. And our reasoning on that, and what's kind of supported by the data, is people who buy addictive drugs tend to buy in bigger quantities. They just don't want to pay the shipping costs to buy multiple times. And so if you are addicted and you keep going back to the same vendor, you tend to just buy more rather than buy more frequently.
So,
Yeah, and kind of,
go on, Grace.
sorry, and yeah, just kind of off that question too, do you think that this kind of model for a legal market has potential to be applied to kind of markets that aren't necessarily online, but still like are illegal? So maybe I was thinking like prostitution almost, you know, it kind of has that situation where buyers would want to go back to the same sellers and kind of similar markets, but might not have as much of an online presence yet.
Yeah. Sorry, the idea of treating a prostitution network as a bipartite network is just really interesting for me for some reason, and I'd never thought of that before, so I'm kind of wrapped up in that in my head. But no, I mean, our expectation is that it would still matter, you know? So one of the things that makes this online case interesting is that we're able to take a case study where people don't have pre-existing social relationships and see how the economic trade matters. But really, we're not trying to say that the pre-existing social relationships don't matter or the economic trade doesn't matter otherwise. We're just trying to say, you know, both kind of happen. So my guess is, yeah, exactly. You know, it should matter in offline illegal markets. Maybe the effects of networks will be a little less pronounced because, exactly as Elena was saying, you know, the structure is less visible. The preference for repeated trade, probably, I would imagine a prostitution network would probably be pretty high. But, you know, I don't know. I don't research that kind of thing. And we're also kind of expecting that with legal online trade, it's really a function of risk. And so in kind of the discussion section of this paper, we make the argument that with the COVID-19 pandemic, people are increasingly buying legal, risky goods from online settings, like houses and cars. The online market for houses and cars has flourished since the COVID-19 pandemic because nobody's showing houses and nobody's meeting up to buy cars. And so this is a similar kind of context. You know, you have more governmental oversight, but still really, really high risk. And so our expectation is these network effects still matter even in those settings.
Yeah, really cool project. Oh,
Thanks for coming, Alexis.
Drop off, so take care. Really cool project. Thanks for sharing. I guess this might be pivot away from previous questions, but I know you mentioned early on that you started this research project when you were in your first year of grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I guess for a lot of us who are still in our formative years of trying to develop research projects, how did you begin to start off this project and to begin like framing this project in a way that speaks to classical literatures? Because I like the way that you framed it as well, and speaking to previous networks literature using this new set of data.
Yeah,
and
no,
how did that process develop over time?
It was really hard, to be blunt, and I think it takes a lot of learning. So it's kind of a you know, this project, part of the reason I'm showing it off is it's probably going to be it has an R&R at AJS right now, and the reviewers really like it. So it looks like that will probably go well. Yeah. But really, this is the 4th or 5th paper that's come out of our grant. And so the earlier work really did not engage with the classical stuff nearly as much. And the earlier work, you know, if you look at my CV, we have a very descriptive paper in Journal of Quantitative Criminology, and we have a very descriptive paper on policing and social networks. And we just published a kind of technical paper, but not theoretically driven paper in PLOS ONE. And then we have another paper that's under review now, looking at prices and things like that. So it took a lot of work to get to this point. It wasn't like we just jumped in with this big theoretical framing. In terms of my personal, how it came about, it came about from a situation that's not unlike the ones you guys are in, where when I was an undergraduate, I really wanted to get into research, and nobody had any interest in paying me. Nobody wanted me on their project because I was at kind of a regional public university, and I had no access to resources to collect my own data anyways. So I did a qualitative study on user communities on online drug forums, and that turned into my senior thesis, and it turned into my first publication. And when I had that, I went to grad school, and I'd already had kind of a publication under my belt on online drug stuff. And my advisor really wanted to create a mutual project. And she had never heard of the darknet, but because of the qualitative work I had done on discussion forums, I did. And so I told her about it, and we went on the darknet, and we had this really awkward advisor meeting where neither of us had looked at these websites before, and we saw a bunch of thumbnails for just like hardcore porn, just being listed over and over, which anyways, just imagine that first year grad school. So it was really awkward, but the point was there was good network data. And so I fielded a pilot study, and we leveraged the pilot study into a grant, and that's what funded it. And so the thing is, like, you know, it took a long time. This is data that I've been working with it was a context I've been working on for almost 6 years now, and it's data I've been working with for 4 or 5. And it's only now kind of coming into these big papers that are dealing with classical theory. So it took a while. But the other thing I want to emphasize, though, because I know the way I framed that could be kind of discouraging, is that part of the reason it took a while was because when I started, I was an undergrad. You know, when you're further along in the program, you get training in how to frame theory, you get training on how to think about the big questions, you get training on how to frame a paper and write a paper, and you get hands-on feedback. And so when our first papers were coming out, I didn't have any of that. And that's part of the reason why the first papers were so descriptive. was because I just didn't know any better. And then as I moved along in graduate school, I kind of cut my teeth a bit more and had a bit more of a sense of how to do it. So yeah, does that answer your question, Todd? Or do you want me to say a few more thoughts off the top of my head?
That answers mine. I mean, I'm willing to hear more about,
Okay.
personal stories about how this product developed, because I think that's helpful for everyone. Or if anyone else have any questions following up on that great answer.
I had a question. This might be too specific, and you might have already mentioned this, but so weed is considered a drug in this study, correct?
Mm-hmm.
We're like, I guess what's like the volume of weed compared to like other types of drugs? Like, you'd like distinguish between addictive drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering, like, did you like try to exclude certain types of drugs and see whether these things like the network structure still held up?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. One is we do kind of have an exclusion. So by controlling every type of drug, we are excluding differences in the hazard rates and purchasing rates for each one. So we have a bit of that by design. We have looked across separate types of drugs, and the effects tend to be weaker, but mostly consistent. Thanks for coming, Rui. And yeah, I would love to talk about networks too. But the other thing is with darknet markets, people actually engage in more polydrug experimentation. And the idea is, when you're on top of a bakery, you're more likely to buy different types of cakes, right? So when you have all those options in front of you, people are more likely to experiment. And so you don't actually necessarily want to break out the network by type because there's so much crossing between the networks. Okay, it's David, right? Yeah, I think that's right. It's not Devin. I think it's David. But for the sociology students, I also just wanted to come back to Todd's question. And I think one of the big things I learned is if you have new data, you can kind of think through what your data can answer that other data can't. And so with my question, it was, we have really cool transaction level data and nobody else really has it, right? And so when you get at that, you start asking, well, what can my data say that other people can't? And what have other people said about it? And the more you can pull on those threads and kind of pull out how different camps have thought different ways about the same topic, the more you can hone in on a novel contribution. So we have a paper on prices, and one of the things we say is like, look, economists have been dominating this work on illegal prices, and economists haven't had data. Everything's been theoretical. The things that have exist are descriptive. And everything sociology has been saying is about network effects. So we have data that talks about network effects. Now, on one hand, you have to be upfront about the limitations of your data. So we're very explicit in being like, we do not have data that represents most types of trade, right? Online drug trade is a minority. But you can also flip that into a strength. And we say, on the other hand, the digital economy is growing, and it's growing for drugs too. And we are focusing on that. And so, I think pivoting these kinds of new types of data into an effective paper is, in many ways, focusing in on what your data can say that other data haven't been able to before. To the extent that you can tie it into ongoing debates, makes it, more convincing and broadens your audience. And the extent that you can say, these are the limitations, but there's also a lot of strengths here. And to really focus on the strengths and develop them, I think those are usually kind of the things that people want to see that make the papers more effective. That's my opinion, but it is an opinion, so.
Cool. So I think we've reached around 4 p.m. So I guess we should call it off, so to speak, unless anyone have any meandering questions. But I thank you very much, Scott, for presenting this really cool paper and for sharing how this developed as well. It's really great, and I hope this serves as an opportunity, kind of give other sociology students and other students as well an opportunity to get to know your work and connect with you later on down the line.
Yeah, I think that's right. And if anybody's interested about networks, don't hesitate to reach out. I love networks and I love talking about them. So.
All right, so I think maybe Scott and Will, we could stay on the call for a little bit, but I think we'll end it there. So, thank you very much. I think next time we'll be meeting 2 weeks from now. I think I'll be going over I'll be continuing our web scraping series, and I think it's specifically like learning about HTML code and how to interact with websites. So I look forward to seeing some of you on that next 2 weeks from now. So until then, have a good weekend. Take care of yourselves. It's been a terrible time. It's been a tough time, let's just say, this past week. But I hope we'll be able to take care of ourselves, recharge during the weekend, and pull through. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, Scott and Todd.
Yeah.
Scott, I actually had